Whisky snobs love to be able to brag that they can taste a whisky and tell you which whisky region of Scotland it comes from. But there's a lot of differences between the regions, and it can be kind of hard to tell the differences. So in this video series, I'm going to take you through the 5 official whisky regions of Scotland, the key flavour characteristics to look out for, so that you might actually be able to taste and recognise a whisky region in the glass. Hey guys, I'm Nate Martin, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whisky enthusiast. I love all things whisky. Now, the Scotch Whisky Association has specified 5 official whisky regions and localities in Scotland, being the Highlands, Lowlands, Speyside, Campbeltown, and Islay. There's also a 6th unofficial region that a lot of people think should be a region on its own. I recently did a video series on that where each video focused on one particular region, spoke about the history of those regions, the flavours those regions produce, and recommended one whisky that's a great example of the flavours from that region, so that you've got a reference point if you're tasting other whiskies and you want to be able to try and categorise it in a whisky region. What I've done here is I've put all of those videos together. So if you just want to watch one long video that just covers, it's not that long, that covers all of the 5 official whisky regions and the 6th unofficial region, they're all here in one place. So I'm going to let you go through that now. Geographically, and this is what we used to use before Google Maps, the Lowland region occupies Scotland's southernmost parts, stretching from the Firth of Clyde in the west to the Firth of Tay in the east, bordered by the Highland line to the north and England to the south. It's close to major cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow, which makes it really accessible for whisky lovers wanting to visit distilleries in the region. It's home to farmland, rolling countryside, fertile hills, and a relatively mild climate. Much of the area also has sedimentary rock with coal deposits, which gets important later. Now, although plenty of farming occurs in the region, that's not actually the most important part for the whisky region's iconic flavour. Now, Lowland whiskies are renowned for being a more gentle whisky, with light, sweet and floral undertones. The Lowlands are the most populated region of Scotland, and as a result they industrialised early. So many of the region's local distilleries during boom periods would produce as much volume as possible to make whisky for blenders. And as a result, they would use the locally available coal, which was reasonably cheap, in order to dry out the barley as part of the whisky making process. Now, coal burns quite cleanly and therefore doesn't impart anywhere near as much flavour on the grain as more traditional methods like peat. And don't worry, I'll get to peat for the smoke lovers when we're in the right regions. Also, while many Scottish distilleries usually only double distill their whisky, in the Lowlands it was common practice to triple distill. This would produce a much cleaner, lighter whisky that was much easier for blenders to work with, and as a result it became a real characteristic feature of that flavour profile. It's worth noting that many of the Lowland distilleries that were producing whisky for blenders and triple distilling, they went bust in the 80s and 90s after a period of overproduction. And the only whisky distillery in the Lowlands region that still triple distills all of their whisky is Auchentoshan. But tradition has a tendency of hanging around, and that's why even though most distilleries in the Lowlands aren't triple distilling anymore, it's still quite characteristic for the Lowland distilleries to deliberately produce a whisky that is lighter and easy drinking. So you can expect flavour notes like floral aromas like honeysuckle and orange blossom, sweeter flavours that come across like cream and vanilla and caramel, and spicy undertones of cinnamon and ginger, and light herbal or even grassy finishes. These gentle qualities make Lowland whiskies perfect for people who are being introduced to Scottish whisky for the first time, or even just those who like a really nice, easy drinking dram. While the Lowlands no longer boast the same number of distilleries as Speyside or the Highland region, they're still known for a number of really notable brands, including Auchentoshan, which I already mentioned is famous for triple distillation, as well as a smooth, nutty character. Glenkinchie, known as the Edinburgh malt, its whiskies are really light and grassy. Bladnoch, one of Scotland's oldest distilleries, producing fruity and floral whiskies, and the only Scottish distillery owned by an Australian. Lindores Abbey, producing delicate, well-balanced whiskies. And Rosebank, once known as the King of the Lowlands, which has been closed for decades but only recently reopened in 2024. There's other notable distilleries including Annandale, Daftmill, Lochley and Holly Road, and the region's also seeing quite a resurgence, with new distilleries like Eden Mill, Kingsbarn and Glasgow Distillery adding modern flair. While the Lowland region has that traditional style, distilleries are always looking for ways to produce new and unique and different tasting whiskey. So not every whiskey from the Lowland region is going to taste iconically like a Lowland region whiskey. It's not always going to be light, sweet and floral. But if you want to experience that classic Lowland whiskey style, the whiskey I'd recommend would be Glenkinchie 12-year-old. So this whiskey it's an affordable, widely available whiskey. It's part of the distillery's core range, so it's not likely to be discontinued anytime soon. And the flavours you can expect from this fit that typical Lowland style. On the nose, you're going to get freshly cut grass, vanilla, lemon, and a little bit of cinnamon and malt. On the palate, it's medium-bodied with stewed fruits, creamy vanilla and a touch of oak. And then herbal notes emerge on the finish, which leaves a grassy, lingering aftertaste. It's a classic example of a Lowland whiskey, and it's a really good starting point for realistically anyone new to the region. Now, geographically, the Highlands covers a really vast area, stretching from just north of Glasgow all the way up to the northernmost tip of Scotland. The region includes towering mountains, serene glens, dramatic coastlines, and even remote islands. Historically, Highland whiskey was made on smaller stills than in comparison to the Lowland whiskies. And this is partially because there was less farming land in the Highlands in which to grow barley, so they had less grain to work with. So they were making whiskey in much smaller batches on smaller stills. Now, this resulted in a richer, much heavier expression. But it's also because the Distillers Act of 1786 introduced a licensing system so that the government could raise tax revenue, as they always do, and it actually put a lot of restrictions on Highland whiskey. So the Highland licensing actually specified that Highland stills could not exceed 40 gallons, they could only use locally grown barley, and they could only be consumed in the local district. They even restricted licensing to only 2 stills per parish. But enforcing these regulations in a remote area like the Highlands became very problematic, and illicit distilling ran kind of rampant. Ignoring the tax authorities, most Highland distillers focused on producing good quality whiskey that they could feed into their local Scottish cities. And by the 19th century, Highland whiskey was actually considered to be much higher quality than most other whiskies on the market. While these restrictions are no longer in place, and most Highland distillers can produce as much whiskey as they want, ordering in grain and producing in volume, those years of producing in small batches has still had a lasting effect on Highland whiskey. And you can always expect Highland whiskey to be slightly more robust and full-bodied with stronger aromas and flavours than things like your Lowland whiskies. But beyond this, because the Highlands are such a large area, there's a whole bunch of microclimates, and you get large variations in the style of whiskey being produced throughout that region. That diversity makes a really fascinating region to explore, but quite problematic when you're trying to define a specific flavour for the region. And for this reason, the Highlands are often broken down into 4 unofficial sub-regions. But before I go into the sub-regions, if you want to taste a whiskey that is just an overall good example of the Highlands as a whole, go for your Glenmorangie 10-year-old. On the nose, you've got caramel, fresh bread, lemon, apple, and toasted pecans. On the palate, there's oranges, vanilla, tiramisu, and toffee, all with a really long malty finish. It's a robust flavour profile and is generally a really good example of the modern Highland whiskey in general. Now, the Northern Highlands is the largest sub-region of the largest whiskey region. So if you think of an imaginary line between Fort Williams and Inverness, pretty much everything north of that is the Northern Highland. It's mostly flat plateaus with sea and ocean surrounding it, with most of the distilleries on the east coast. And these include well-known distilleries like Ardnamurchan, Clynelish, Dalmore, Glenmorangie, Old Pulteney, Royal Brackla, Tomatin, and Wolfburn. The flavours you can expect from the Northern Highlands are complex, malty whiskies with cereal aromas, fruit sweetness, and heather and spice. And a good entry-level example of this is the Tomatin 12. It's been aged in bourbon and sherry casks. This whiskey is affordably priced, and it really exemplifies that Northern Highland region. So on the nose, you've got wild heather, pine, and cedar. The palate is full-bodied with creme caramel, apples, pears, and mango, with a really buttery finish. I would show you a bottle, but I'm a big fan of the Highland region. Most of the Highland whiskies don't last long in this household. Moving down, we have the Central Highlands, which is sometimes also referred to as the Southern Highlands or even the Midlands. It's the region between Speyside and Lowlands and, East and West Highlands. It's pretty much the region of Perth and the surrounding area, but it sort of extends out beyond that. It includes distilleries like Aberfeldy, Blair Athol, Dalwhinnie, Deanston, Edgeadore, Glengoyne and Glenturret. Geographically, the Central Highlands region is a lot more similar to the Lowlands, and as a result the whisky that they produce is kind of like a lighter version of the Highland whiskies. It's not quite as light as Lowland, but it's somewhere in between. So you can expect a lighter whisky with generally notes of honey, fruit, heather, and a bit of like a dried sweetness on the finish. For this, a great example is the Edgeadore 10-year-old. Aged 100% in Oloroso sherry casks, this whisky is sweet, it's approachable, and it's part of their core range, so it's always going to be available. On the nose, you can expect things like dried fruits, sherry and almonds. On the palate, there's spicy Christmas cake, golden syrup, and a touch of honeyed almonds. And on the finish, it's oaky with soft spices and a lingering warmth. The Edgeadore distillery itself has made very little changes to its processes in the last 150 years, so this is a really great example of a classic Central Highlands style. Eastern Highlands, as you expect, are east of the Central Highlands. They're below Speyside and above Lowlands. And you're looking at distilleries like Fettercairn, Glencadam, Glendronach, Glengarioch, Glenglaslow, Knockdhu, and Royal Lacknagar. The whiskies from the Eastern Highlands are known for being full-bodied, dry, earthy, with fruit and a distinctive sweetness. And that distinctive sweetness often actually gets Eastern Highland whiskies mistaken for Speyside. And I think the point of difference you need to look for is that dry, earthy sort of flavours. That's what kind of differentiates them. You don't get them as much in Speyside. But for the perfect introduction to these Eastern Highland flavours, I cannot recommend Glendronach 12 highly enough. This is a whisky that's been aged in Pedro Ximenez and Oloroso sherry casks, and it is incredibly full-bodied. So on the nose, you're going to find raisins, melon, and a sweet, syrupy quality that's almost like dark sugar without being too overpowering. And on the palate, you can pick up sweet flavors of ginger, tobacco, melon, and milk chocolate, followed by orchid fruits, vanilla, and almonds. And then the finish, it's got a medium finish of wood and baking spice, nutmeg, and even more ginger. Now, if you're somebody who loves a good sherry bomb, this is definitely the whiskey for you. And now finally, we've got the Western Highlands. Obviously, to the west of the Central Highlands, below the Northern Highlands, above the Lowlands. You know where it is. And this region is incredibly rugged, mountainous, with loads and loads of rain. And because of the rain, it's not a great farming region. So it hasn't always, in fact, it's really never been a typically traditional whiskey making region. Even today, there's only 4 distilleries in operation, and that's Ben Nevis, Loch Lomond, McNean, and Oban. And it's common for these whiskies to be peated and aged in sherry casks, so you've got the combination of smoke and sweet. Now, when we talk about smoke, it's worth noting here that the peat, the flavour of the smoke that comes out of peat differs for each whiskey region. There's not one homogeneous type of peat that just produces a smoky flavour. And the sort of peat that you're going to get from the Highlands is usually more of a drier, woody, sort of almost like an ashy smoke flavour. And so as a result, the typical flavour profile that you're going to expect from a Western Highland whiskey is something that's bold and full-bodied, often with sweet sherry notes, wood spice, and a touch of that dry, peppery smoke. Now, for a whiskey that really embodies all of these flavours, I'd recommend trying McDonald's celebrated traditional Ben Nevis. Now, this is meant to be a recreation of what the Ben Nevis distillery was producing way back in the 1880s. It's lightly peated and it's aged primarily in sherry casks. So on the nose, you're getting toffee, honey, candied banana, dry smoke, marzipan, and almonds. The palate is richly flavoured with toffee and dry sherry, butterscotch, and cinnamon. And then the finish is buttery, nutty, peppery smoke lingers on the palate. It releases other notes like vanilla and even milk chocolate as it fades. This whiskey was originally only meant to be a limited release. They produced only 700 bottles, but the first batch was so highly regarded that the distillery had to do a second batch. And the second batch didn't even have a limit on the number of bottles. So considering its popularity and the fact they had to produce a second batch, it's my expectation that this is going to become a core range for the distillery. So you should expect to see it on the shelves regularly. So that's the Highlands, a region that is as vast and distinctive almost as the whole of Scotland. So do you have a favourite Highland whiskey? Or probably more importantly, from watching this video and noting the distilleries, did you find that some of your favourites are all clumped into one specific sub-region? Do you have a favourite sub-region of the Highlands? I'd love to know, let me know in the comments. The Speyside region is nestled in the lower northeast corner of the Highlands between Inverness and Aberdeen. It's an incredibly fertile landscape, dotted with glens and hills centred around the running of the River Spey, for which the region is named. The River Spey is considered to be the finest river in Scotland, with incredibly pure waters flowing from its source in the Monolith Mountains. It is one of the most important and productive salmon rivers in the UK, and also incredibly useful for making whisky. So distillers of this region will tell you that the soft, mineral-rich water is perfect for producing smooth, complex, intricate whiskies. And the region itself is also quite warm and dry, so coupled with that access to the really pure water source, it's perfect for growing barley. So with these already favourable conditions, when the Great Northern Railway was built in the late 19th century, it facilitated a lot of transport of additional barley, barrels and coal to the region, giving it a further boost. And that's why today there are over 50 whisky distilleries throughout the Speyside region. In fact, the region is responsible for the production of 50 to 60% of Scottish malt whisky. That is the very reason it is a whisky region. Now previously I went through the Highland region and how it was such a large whisky region that it's being broken down into sub-regions. And the Speyside region used to be a sub-region of Highlands. In fact, it was only in 2009 that Speyside became an official whisky region. However, while it is an official whisky region, it is still somehow classed as a sub-region of Highlands. So distilleries within Speyside can call themselves a Speyside whisky, or they can call themselves a Highland whisky. Dalwhinnie Distillery is located within the Speyside region, but all of their marketing refers to their whisky as a Highland malt. But what makes Speyside whisky stand out? Speyside whiskies are renowned for their elegant and approachable fruit-forward flavour profiles. While there can be variances in flavour between different distilleries, the sorts of flavours you can expect from Speyside include fruity notes, so think crisp apple, pear and dried fruits, honey and vanilla, a hallmark sweetness that defines many Speyside drams, and caramel and spice, which is often imparted by maturation in sherry casks, which is very common amongst Speyside distilleries. Thanks to these characteristics, Speyside whiskies often appeal to a very broad audience, from people who are new to Scotch to whisky aficionados that are looking for really complex flavours without that harsh peaty smokiness. Now, as Speyside is home to over 50 different whisky distilleries, I'm not going to go through them all right here, but some of the notable distillery names that you should look out for are the Glenlivet, which is a pioneer in single malts, offering a light fruity style. Macallan, known for its sherry cask maturation and rich, robust whiskies and a rich price tag. Aberlour, a favourite for fans of sherry influence and complex layers. Glenfiddich, which is one of the world's best-selling single malts, known for a pear-forward flavour profile. And Balvenie, celebrated for craftsmanship and diverse range of cask finishes. And other notable distilleries include Glenfarclas, Craigellachie, Ben Riach and Cragganmore. Whether you're exploring household names or hidden gems, Speyside really is a treasure trove of whisky to explore. For a quintessential Speyside experience, I'm actually going to recommend two different whiskies. Now, if you want to really appreciate the Speyside spirit, those fruit-forward, sweet honey and vanilla flavours, I would say go with the Glenlivet 12-year-old. The Glenlivet distillery was the first licensed distillery in the Speyside region, and the Glenlivet 12 has been aged in ex-bourbon casks, so it doesn't have anywhere near as much of that cask influence on it, so you're really getting to taste and appreciate the flavour of the whisky itself. And the Glenlivet 12 is affordably priced and readily available just about everywhere. And the sorts of flavours you're going to get on this, on the nose, you got crisp citrus, fresh apple and a touch of vanilla. The palate is smooth with sweet notes of honey, ripe pear and subtle oak. And then the finish is gentle and lingering with a soft spice that leaves you wanting more. This whisky is a great example of the Speyside spirit, light, fruity and immensely drinkable. But the Speyside region is also quite known for producing whiskies that have been aged in sherry casks, so I'd be remiss if I didn't make a recommendation that had a very high sherry influence. And for that, I would say go with the Glenfarclas 12-year-old. The Glenfarclas distillery is actually one of the few remaining distilleries in Scotland that is still family owned and operated by the original founders, and Glenfarclas ages just about all of their whiskies in sherry casks. And the Glenlivet 12 has been primarily aged in Oloroso, so you're going to get those sweet, extra sweet flavour notes coming from the sherry casks. So you can expect on the nose cinnamon, apples, oranges and apricots. The palate is full-bodied with notes of hard toffee, fruitcake, raisins, oak and spice. And then the finish, you've got ginger, cinnamon, cloves and honey. Both are really good representations of Speyside whisky, they're just at different ends of that sherry cask spectrum. That's Speyside, the most iconic and most productive whisky region in Scotland. Now, I dare say some of you probably would have come across some of these whiskies before and maybe not even known that they were from the Speyside region, so if you've got a favourite, let me know in the comments below. Now the Campbeltown whisky region, geographically, is located on the southwest coast of Scotland at the foot of the Kintyre Peninsula in West Argyll. A registered whisky region in name, but realistically today, Campbeltown is a small town of 4,500 people that was once touted as the whisky capital of the world. As early as the 1700s, this remote region with a rugged coastline was rife with illicit distilling. The authorities found it really difficult to access the area to locate illicit stills, and so the locals basically did as they liked to produce their drink of choice. So the 1823 Excise Act, which amongst other things introduced a £10 fee for licensing a still, which is a bit more affordable. There are also advancements to transport and things like that. All in all, it led to a boom in legal distilleries. Now this is true for most of the whisky regions in Scotland, but for Campbeltown it really had an explosive effect, for a number of geographical reasons. Firstly, in Campbeltown, there was an abundance of whisky resources. So the Kintyre Peninsula has fertile fields producing barley, peat bogs for malting the barley, pristine waters from Crosshill Loch, and ample coal from Drumlemble mines to fire the stills. Campbeltown Harbour is a natural deep sea harbour that provides a safe port for fishing vessels and commercial ships. And it's only 12 miles from Northern Ireland. Now, arguably, this could actually be where whisky production made its way from Ireland into Scotland in the first place, but it's also quite handy to have a close whisky-loving neighbour that you can send your whisky to. And then steam navigation, which started to take off in the early 1800s. It opened up international shipping, especially for regions situated on a safe, accessible harbour. With all this in the region's favour, by the 1880s there were over 30 licensed distilleries in Campbeltown, and together they were producing almost 2 million gallons of spirit per year. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, Campbeltown was said to have the highest income per capita in the entire UK. Hence how they managed to get the name, the whisky capital of the world. But then there was a series of unfortunate events. The Pattinson crash in 1898 caused a slump in whisky prices, Prohibition in the US eliminated a really key export market, and then there was the Great Depression. All this saw Campbeltown's 30+ distilleries reduced down to only 3 still in operation today. But the whisky produced in Campbeltown has such a distinct and unique character that even with 3 distilleries, it's enough to keep them on the whisky map. But what is so good about Campbeltown whisky, you might ask? These drams are so bold and complex, with distinctive characteristics like briny and salty notes, which reflect that coastal location protruding into the Atlantic. We'll often call this a maritime character. Smoke and peat, perhaps not as heavy as Islay whiskies, but noticeable and layered. Fruity flavours, so think citrus, stone fruits and dried figs. And rich sweetness, like vanilla, toffee and malty undertones. These unique combinations make Campbeltown whiskies stand out, especially for people who love robust, full-bodied whiskies with really unique character. With only 3 yet distinct distilleries in the region, I can actually take you through the characteristics of each. Springbank Distillery, perhaps the most well-known, is renowned for traditional production methods such as fire heating the stills and producing a number of different whiskey labels. So they produce their lightly peated whiskey under the Springbank label, their heavily peated whiskey is labelled as Longrow, and then Hazelburn is their unpeated expressions. You've got Glengyle Distillery, which produces the Kilkerran range, known for a balance of fruity sweetness and gentle smoke. And then Glen Scotia, famous for maritime influence and a rich oily texture. Glen Scotia offers a variety of styles from light and fruity to heavily peated. Together, these distilleries show a wonderful diversity of depth and character of the Campbeltown whisky. As wonderful as Campbeltown whiskies are, the traditional whisky making methods they use aren't known for large-scale production. For example, Springbank's entry-level whiskey, the 10-year-old, is in such limited supply that retailers get a limited allocation each year, and they usually sell out really quickly, despite a $250 to $300 price tag in Australia and over $90 in the US. I'm not saying these whiskies aren't worth that price, but that's kind of out of the budget for most whiskey drinkers. So for a true taste of Campbeltown that is affordable and readily available, I always recommend the Glen Scotia 15. It's rich in character and it has notes like apricot, citrus peel, vanilla and a hint of a salty sea breeze on the nose. The palate is robust with a balance of toffee sweetness, ripe fruits, gentle spice and a subtle brininess. And then the finish is long and satisfying with lingering oak, dried fruit and a whisper of smoke. And the really interesting thing about that finish is that whisper of smoke, because the Glen Scotia 15 is an unpeated whiskey, and yet it still managed to have that faint hint of smoke. And the distillery itself does produce peated whiskey as well, so I don't know if that smoke is coming from the same stills that are used to make a peated spirit, or if the Campbeltown region is so damn peat infused that everything has an element of smoke. But I've picked up this note on pretty much all of the unpeated releases from Campbeltown region. They've always got that faint hint of smoke, which is why this is such a great example of Campbeltown whiskey. It's rich, it's bold, it's complex, and it still has that characteristic briny maritime expression and a hint of smoke. So that's Campbeltown, a small region with a big reputation. Have you explored any of these old maritime drams? Are you one of the hardcore fans that's on the waiting list for each annual Springbank release? If you have a favourite, let me know in the comments below. Nicknamed the Whiskey Island, Islay is spelt Islay, but it's pronounced Isla. It is the only whiskey region of Scotland that is a single island. Now, if you want to find Islay, it is located to the southwest of Campbeltown Whiskey region. The island itself is quite small. It's only 40 kilometres long and 32 kilometres at its widest, 620 square kilometres or 240 square miles. It has a permanent population of just over 3,000 people, and yet it still has 10 working distilleries. The coastline is indented with sea locks and bays with outcroppings of rocky peninsulas. Its position on the west coast exposes the southwest of the island to strong winds, but most importantly, the island benefits from its proximity to the Gulf Stream, which keeps the climate mild compared to mainland Scotland. As a result, the island itself is surprisingly fertile, with some wooded areas, thriving agriculture, freshwater lochs, and rivers with fantastic brown trout and salmon fishing. The coastal positioning has also produced some really unique peat, which has a strong influence on the whiskey region's flavours, but I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Islay is also very close to Ireland, about 150 kilometres or 95 miles as the crow flies. So it's believed that Irish monks began distillation on Islay in the early 14th century. It was an ideal location for whiskey production. You had great barley growing climate, plenty of pure soft water in the freshwater lochs and rivers, and seemingly unlimited supplies of peat. Whiskey production was carried out openly on the island until 1644, when taxes were levied by the British through the Excise Act. But the people of Islay were known to be a wild, barbarous people, and so the authorities weren't keen to try and enforce those taxes. As a result, whiskey production was mostly illicit from then on, but it was very, very uncontrolled. And because of this, the whiskey consumption was extremely heavy. A reverend on the island in 1777 was reported to say, "The quantity of Islay whiskey made here is very great, and the evil that follows drinking to excess of this liquor is very visible on the island." It sounds like a good time. As I've covered before, the introduction of the Excise Act in 1823 provided affordable licensing for distillers. So it gave them an avenue to affordably license their stills and actually begin production legally. And with legal production now attainable, authorities did make more of an effort to crack down on illicit distilling. This saw more licensed distilleries begin operation, but for some reason, whiskey production on Islay was rather fickle. Over the last 200 or 300 years, there's been over 30 distilleries on the island, but never really more than 10 operating at a time. And from the 1860s up until the late 1900s, most of what was produced on Islay, and I'm talking about 90%, was actually only made for blends to go into things like Johnny Walker, Whitehorse, the famous grouse, Bells, and many more like that. But why? And that could come down to the characteristic flavours of the Islay region. Now, most people who dabble in whiskey will be able to tell you that Islay whiskies are quite smoky. They are known for being a bold, smoky whiskey. And that comes down to the type of peat that's produced in Islay. Now, for those who don't know, peat is a form of partially decomposed plant matter that can be dried out and burnt to be used as fuel. It's sort of somewhere half between decomposing plants and coal. It's on the transition there. And for whiskey production, you would dry out the peat, burn it, and the smoke is what would dry out the barley that would then later be fermented, distilled, and put in barrels to be aged to make whiskey. And when you use peat for this, it imparts a really strong smoky flavour on whiskey. Now, in most locations, peat is primarily decomposing grasses, mosses, and shrub matter like that. But on Islay, which was once submerged beneath the sea, the peat in this region is actually seaweed and other marine vegetation, which produces some quite unique smoky flavours that come across as being very salty and briny and even medicinal, like iodine. And so as a result, the unique flavours that you're going to get from Islay whiskies are smoke, as I said, ranging from gentle to heavily medicinal, briny and coastal notes. So that's bold, salty flavours that come both from the Islay peat and the proximity to the sea during aging, a fruity sweetness, so primarily vanilla and caramel coming from the ex-bourbon casks that are used to balance those bold flavors while allowing the smoky elements to kind of shine. And at the same time, there are also unpeated options. Distilleries like Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain do showcase the versatility of Islay with lighter unpeated whiskies. But those bold, medicinal, smoky flavors of Islay whiskies are kind of a love or hate affair. You'll often find many whiskey drinkers who love a broad range of whiskies do not like Islay whiskies, and you'll also find others that are just complete fanatics and only an Islay whiskey will do. Islay distilleries are kind of icons in the whiskey world. Unfortunately, with only 10 on the island, I can take you through a little bit of a summary of each, going through in order of when they opened. Starting with Bowmore Distillery, which opened in 1779. It's the oldest distillery on the island and the second oldest distillery in all of Scotland. It's known for its balanced profile of smoke, coastal and tropical fruity notes. Ardbeg Distillery, officially licensed in 1815, it's famous for intense smoky whiskies with a cult following. Seriously, there's an Ardbeg cult. Club. Lefroy, also licensed in 1815, is known for its medicinal peatiness with robust character. Lagavulin, licensed in 1816, is known for rich peaty drams with a maritime touch, as well as being a favourite of the iconic actor and woodworker Nick Offerman, who has become an ambassador of the distillery with a few expressions bearing his name. Caol Ila, licensed in 1846. Its initial focus was on producing whiskey for blends, and really only started releasing single malt bottlings prominently in the 2000s. Thankfully, as the combination of smoke with a clean citrusy profile is quite enjoyable. It's also the whiskey that provides the smoke flavour in Johnnie Walker. Bunnahabhain, first licensed in 1881, they offer a lighter, fruitier whiskey with minimal peat influence. If you are hesitant of those smoky whiskey flavours and are interested in exploring the Islay region, Bunnahabhain would probably actually be a really good entry point. Bruichladdich, initially licensed in 1881, the distillery closed in 1995 but was reopened in 2000, after which it became celebrated for innovation and a wide range of styles, including the incredibly peated Octomore and several unpeated expressions. Kilchoman, founded in 2005, was the first new distillery on Islay in over 120 years. It is a farm distillery producing their own grain to make young yet complex whiskies that stand out amongst distilleries with reputations that go back centuries. Ardnahoe, a new addition built in 2016 and licensed in 2018, is blending tradition with a modern flair. Their inaugural release was only last year in 2024, but has been getting good reviews and I actually quite enjoyed it. Lastly, Port Ellen. Originally started as a malt mill in 1825, it operated as a distillery from 1833 to 1930, and then again from 1966 to 1983, and reopened last year in March of 2024 and is being redesigned to push innovation, experimentation and sustainability. But it'll be years before we see an actual official whiskey come out of this distillery. With all that in mind, if I was to recommend one whiskey that's a great example of Islay flavour, it would be the Lagavulin 8. This is affordably priced and readily available, but it's a great introduction to the Islay region's smoky character while offering complexity beyond its age. So in this whiskey, you can expect things like a pale gold appearance with bright, inviting sort of shimmer. The nose is big and smoky with hints of sweet spice, lemon zest and sea air. The palate, it's a powerful wave of peat smoke balanced by creamy vanilla, crisp apple and a warming spice. And the finish is long and smoky with lingering sweet spice and a touch of salt. This whiskey pays tribute to Lagavulin's heritage, and supposedly the 8-year expression was actually influenced by a gentleman in the 1800s who visited the distillery and stated that the 8-year was an exceptionally fine whiskey. And this was at a time when age statements weren't really a thing. It's bold, approachable and pure Islay smoke. But the other thing to take note of too is the light colour. This is kind of iconic for the Islay region. I stated that they typically age a lot of their whiskies in bourbon casks, and for some reason Islay whiskies seem to take less colour from the cask compared to the same age statement of whiskies aged in other areas of Scotland. I don't know the reason for this, it might be down to the climate, but test it out yourself at home. If you've got a 12-year-old Islay whiskey and you compare it to a 12-year-old Speyside or anything else that's been aged in bourbon casks, you will most likely notice a very lighter colour in the Islay whiskies compared to other regions, which can be a little bit of an indicator to give you a bit of an idea that if it's light in colour and has that medicinal smoke flavour, it's probably an Islay whiskey. So while that's a great example of the Islay smoke flavour, if you are hesitant about those big bold flavours, do try something from Bunnahabhain. They do have lightly peated expressions, which are a great introduction to the region, and they can allow you to just gradually increase your peat. While the Scotch Whisky Association, or SWA, have specified the boundaries of the 5 official whisky regions, being Speyside, Campbeltown, Islay, Highlands and Lowlands, the islands are still a matter of debate. Many would argue, and I'm one of them, that the islands deserve a spot on the whisky map of their own. I previously spoke about the Highland whisky region and how it was so large that it has been broken down into 4 unofficial sub-regions, as well as Speyside, which is a region within a region. I also covered Islay, which is another whisky region that is also an island of its own. It's known as the Whisky Island. But the coastline of Scotland has over 700 islands, about 100 of which are inhabited, but they just fall into the Highland region. Now, if the Highland region is so large that it already needs to be broken down into sub-regions as microclimates, it's really unrealistic to expect that these island locations surrounded by the ocean in different climates are going to have a very similar flavour profile to the rest of the Highlands. The fact of the matter is they just don't. And that is why many whisky lovers today consider the islands to almost be their own unofficial whisky region. In fact, there are several maps that show the whisky regions of Scotland that don't break the Highlands down into those 4 sub-regions, but they do class the islands as their own region. It's just not an official region. And there's really good justification for this as well. Throughout the islands off the coast of Scotland, excluding Islay, there are actually 13 active distilleries. Now that's more than the 3 active distilleries in Campbeltown, it's more than the 10 distilleries on Islay, and it's on par with the amount of distilleries in the Lowlands. It's even more than the amount of distilleries in some of the sub-regions of the Highlands. So if the number of active distilleries is what's counted, there's perfect validity to make the islands a whisky region of their own. But the main reason they aren't classed as their own region is probably just down to tradition. They have always been clumped in with the Highlands, and many don't see the need to actually officially change that. But there's still room to do that. I mean, the Speyside region only became an official region in 2009, so with enough push, it's possible that we could actually make the islands off the coast of Scotland their own whisky region. But how distinctive are island whiskies compared to the mainland? Now, because each island is different, they're differently sized, differently positioned, exposed to different sea currents and winds, the flavours produced by island whiskies can be extremely varied. They vary just as much from each other as they do from mainland whiskies. What is somewhat consistent with island whiskies though is that point of difference, the uniqueness that they are all so different to each other based on their location to a point of difference. Take Orkney for instance. Windswept and treeless, the peat here is woodless, predominantly made up of heather, which is a type of shrub, and it gives Orkney whiskies a distinctive aromatic profile with herbal, earthy and even slightly smoky elements. On the other hand, Jura whiskies bring a different flavour profile to the table. Known for their sweetness and nuttiness, Jura whiskies are often aged in sherry casks, imparting rich, fruity and spicy notes that contrast with the salty Maritime influence. But if you want characteristics to help you pick an island whisky out of something from the mainland, be on the lookout for those briny, salty notes. And that's because island whiskies are usually aged in barrels quite close to the sea where there's strong coastal breezes. It is also reasonably common for island distilleries to use peat. So be aware of smoky flavours that notably differ from those medicinal notes that you get from the Islay region and those ashy peat flavours that you tend to get from mainland Highland whiskies. But island whiskies are usually shaped by the unique location. So often the biggest indicator that it's an island whisky is that it just doesn't fit with any of the other categories. At the time of filming this video, there are actually 13 active whisky distilleries on the islands, excluding the Islay region. So I've got the time to go through each of them. Starting at the far north, you've got Lerwick Distillery on the Shetland Islands. Only released their first blended whiskies late last year in 2024. It's blended from mainland source casks, so it's marketed as whiskey from the edge of the world. They will eventually release a locally made and aged Shetland Island whiskey. Moving down to the Orkney Island, you've got Highland Park. Though an island distillery, very much lean into that Highland region name. They're actually one of the few islands outside of Islay that uses seaweed-based peat, though they only use about 20% peated barley. So you'll find flavour notes of subtle yet medicinal smoke, honeyed sweetness with heather and dried fruits, along with briny, salty note. Scapa Distillery, also on Orkney, typically doesn't use peat, so their whiskies are known for a smooth, fruity, subtle, sweet flavour profile with a distinctive maritime influence. You've got Aveen Jarek on Isle of Lewis, a relatively new player having opened in 2008, but it is known for traditional methods, producing robust, oily, cereal-led flavours with a distinct balance between green, fruity flavours, smoky notes and salt. The peat on this whisky carries distinctive dried spice flavours. Isle of Harris Distillery produces Hira, a whisky characterised by a blend of sweet and smoky notes with a hint of saltiness. It often features aromas of heather, green apples and subtle peatiness, alongside creamy vanilla, clotted cream and a touch of sea spray. Benbeculu Distillery is a new one that has not yet released an aged whisky, but they are promising a classically maritime style flavour with sweet, salty, smoky notes. Isle of Raasay Distillery, opened in 2017, offers an emerging range of single malts. Their signature flavour notes are light peat smoke, dark fruit flavours with a subtle hint of spice. The peat comes across as a wood smoke with a touch of pepper. Talisker on the Isle of Skye has long been famous for bold, cereal-forward peated whiskies with strong coastal notes and citrus sweetness. Torra Bay Distillery is a newer addition on Skye, known for a gentle peat blended with floral, herbal notes, sea air, honey and vanilla. Tobermory Distillery on the Isle of Mull produces both peated and unpeated expressions under different names. So you have Lechaig, which is the peated releases, with strong salty smoke flavours as well as floral notes with hints of fruit and spice. It's worth noting that while Mull's peat is not seaweed peat like Islay, the strong salty notes tend to make the peat come across as medicinal, quite similar to Islay. While the Tobermory label is unpeated and has distinctive character of gentle sweet, fruity, citrus flavours with hints of cinnamon, clove and a subtle salty undercurrent. Jura Distillery on the Isle of Jura is known for its sweet, nutty, oily whiskies matured in sherry casks to balance the subtle smoke with fruity flavours. Loquenza Distillery on the Isle of Arran produces Arran whisky. It's known for malty cereal character with subtle notes of citrus and orchard fruits, and is one of the few whiskies that actually is more Highland in style. However, their Macri Moor range is the peated expression, with smoke notes described as a smouldering bonfire with pungent notes and hints of sea vegetation, balanced with typical Arran orchard fruit flavours. Lastly, also on the Isle of Arran, is Larg Distillery. It is known for a complex bold peat flavour, a combination of intense smoke, vaguely medicinal with notes of the sea, creamy vanilla and citrus. So you can see why they are all quite different. Most tend to bring across salt and smoke flavours, balanced out with some other unique notes that are characteristic to their location. If I was going to recommend something that resonates as an island whisky for me, something that's affordable and readily available for most people to try, it would be the Talisker 10. This is a staple from the Isle of Skye, and it perfectly encapsulates the salt, smoke, and the local influences of island whiskies. So on something like this, on the nose, you can expect strong peppery smoke, sweet pear and apple peels with salty maritime notes. The palate, there's more peppery smoke, it's briny with biscuity notes from the malted barley, as well as some orchard fruits and citrus for a bit of balance. And then the finish is toasted malt, lingering campfire smoke with a sugary underlay. It's a great example of that locality influence I was talking about. The peat smoke is maritime influence, but it's not exactly the same as Islay. The flavours from the malted barley actually make its way through into the palate, and you've just got that coastal saltiness right there. This is a distillery I visited, and I can tell you from personal experience that the wall of their barrel aging room is so close to the sea that if you were on the road next to it and it was high tide and a car came towards you, you would be taking a plunge in a single leap. Those whiskey barrels are a couple of steps away from the sea, and that comes through on the palate. So that's the 5 official whisky regions of Scotland, plus the islands, which most of us already call a region anyway, regardless of what the Scotch Whisky Association says. But from watching this video and hearing the distilleries that are in each region, have you found that you've actually got a favourite region? Have you found that most of the whiskies that you gravitate towards all come from one locality? Please share in the comments below. I love to hear that sort of thing. Or are you more of a whiskey explorer like me? You like various whiskies from various locations because you like that point of difference. Now, I've spoken about the key flavours that each region is known for. The other thing to remember is every single distillery wants to do something different. So not every whiskey from the Highlands is going to taste like a Highland whiskey. Not every whiskey from Islay is going to taste medicinally peated. They're all different and they all need to be explored. But this video should at the very least give you the basics of those core flavors that you're looking for. If you want to try and place a whiskey in a region, you've got those there as a tool, and you've got a great example whiskey to help you work with it as a reference point. But at the end of the day, all that really matters is that you're enjoying the whiskey. So as I say at the end of every video, enjoy what's in your glass and slange. Oh yeah, and subscribe. I do a lot of videos like this, so subscribe so you'll catch the next one. Cheers.